Next, from Chicago, we sit down with University of Illinois at Chicago professor and former Chicago alderman Dick Simpson and discuss the effects of the lengthy state budget impasse, the need for term limits, and two of Professor Simpson's books, Corrupt Illinois and 21st Century Chicago. This runs about 30 minutes.
Professor Dick Simpson, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Glad to do it.
We wanted to talk to you about a number of things, and one, you had two recently published books which we'd like to touch on, but let's first start. As a longtime observer of the Illinois political scene, a lot of people say that what we're seeing going on in the State House right now is something they've not seen in 30 or 40 years. What is your take on what's happening?
Yes, it's true. We've never had a budget impasse that's lasted this long. It's not been unusual for the state legislature to finish the session without a budget, and for a matter of a couple of days, a couple of weeks, negotiations between the legislative leaders and the governor occur, and then they come to an agreement and pass a budget. That hasn't happened this time. People are now fearful that it'll be at least into January before we get a budget, and that's having very harmful effects. To give an example, at the University of Illinois, we face, even if they had a budget, a 31% cut in state funding, or a loss of $209 million. Our students...
Is that across the three campuses?
That's across the three campuses. At the UIC alone, 8,000 of our students use MAP grants, which are the loans, the grants to State of Illinois students. We've been covering their grants that they would normally get so that they can go to school. There's a threat that as many as 6 universities might not open in January if there is no budget and no indication of when there would be a budget. We will be able to open. Surveys of social service agencies are showing dire consequences. Nearly every social service agency has had to either cut the number of clients in programs, or a number of them have gone out of business. So even when we get a budget, there are going to be permanent harms to the people of Illinois for this budget impasse.
One of the reasons that people said this has set a record as far as the delay in the budget is that there hasn't been the pain impacted across a broad enough field. If the teachers weren't getting paid, if the state employees weren't getting paid, there would have been more of a clamor and pressure on lawmakers to bring this together. And it is the universities and the social service agencies are the ones who are basically getting the short end of the stick, to use that terminology, who aren't getting the money. And on the other hand, Speaker Madigan is saying what the governor is asking for is not really part of the budget, that he's asking for things that might be debated, but they shouldn't be part of the budget deal. What's your take on that, as the governor asks for things like term limits and redistricting?
Well, I think some of the items could be negotiated that are in the governor's request in his turnaround budget, things like unemployment insurance and those kinds of issues. I even think term limits would be one on which they could come to an agreement, because they probably wouldn't take effect for 12 years.
Should it be part of the,
it shouldn't ideally be part of the budget, but it's not unusual that other issues come into the budget. The problem is, with the fundamental thing the governor wants to do is destroy the trade unions and the labor unions, particularly for public employees and for teachers. Leave aside the arguments about all of that. That is going to be a stumbling block, because that's an issue on which the Democratic majority both ideologically can't do it, they don't believe it's the right thing to do, and they have the labor unions are major supporters of the Democratic Party. The base of the Democratic Party wouldn't allow them to do it. So Governor Rauner is going to have to take a partial victory and say he got some things, and then they're going to be able to, they're going to have to negotiate. I mean, the difference, again, to use the universities as an example, the Democrats say the university should have an 8% cut. The governor says the university should have a 31 or 32% cut. That's a big difference. That's not, you know, a few dollars here or a few dollars there. It does require sitting down and coming to a compromise position, which is probably partway between the two numbers. And that's true throughout the budget. That's not, I'd just use that as an example of how severe the budget differences are, even if they didn't have the governor's turnaround budget or turnaround program that's standing in the way of a budget compromise.
It's interesting on one hand some of the divisions that this is causing, and it's not always as obvious as it might seem. We have people who have been lifelong Democrats who are in favor of term limits, who are in favor of redistricting. On the other hand, I just saw an article today where some of the business groups are kind of coming out against the governor and saying, you know, you're destroying the Illinois business environment. This is crazy. No one will want to move a business here.
It is a very severe problem when it goes on this long. Business requires certainty. They can live by all kinds of rules. They can live under machine politics. They can live under good government. But they want to know what the rules of the game are. And in Illinois at the moment, the only rule of the game is stalemate or gridlock.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, but if we had some of the universities or some of the community colleges closed down because they didn't have the funds to be able to continue through the second semester this spring, would they be able to restart, or would they be closed down until May or June?
They probably wouldn't. It would depend on when the agreement was reached. You know, the real danger is if you close a university, you may never be able to start it up again, because you could lose faculty, you could lose students. You know, we have to have contingency plans at the University of Illinois to absorb several thousand students if other places close. It's not what we're not trying to steal their students. We don't want that to happen. But it will be a major crisis. You know, most of them are figuring out a way to keep going a little while longer, so I think most of them are going to start, but they're right at the edge. Places like Eastern Illinois University, Western has said they will reopen. Southern is in a little better shape, but not much. Chicago State University. We have all of the what might be thought of as the regional universities in the public university system don't have a big reserve fund. They don't have large alumni funds. They don't have research dollars that are large enough to float the entire university. They have research dollars. And the same thing is happening in the social services. Some of these social services are going to require, going to cause permanent harm. This is not, when Jim Edgar was governor and he had a similar situation in 1992 when he had to make major cutbacks, his one rule is, I won't cut it if it's going to cost someone their life. At least start with the basics. Well, this stalemate is going to cost people their lives. People in mental health clinics, people who are homeless, people who are on the margins of society, people who can't get mental health assistance with drug problems. People are going to die. This has now reached the point where we're not talking about minor inconveniences. You know, for someone like me, if I, you know, didn't get, you know, maybe a check for a month, I could survive, but many people can't.
Well, and we have a board member on the Illinois Channel who runs the LIHEAP program, and as we sit here today, it's a relatively balmy day for November, but if we get a deep freeze coming and people just don't have utilities, or if their utilities are shut off, I mean, they could literally die of hypothermia in their room. So, I mean, not to make it overly dramatic, but that's just the facts.
I mean, that's just the way it is. So we're at a point where we need a resolution. The governor and the four leaders are meeting right after Thanksgiving. One would hope they would actually meet in a productive sense and resolve the fundamentals of stalemate. If the governor and the four leaders agreed, we could have a budget in 48 hours. It's just a matter of calling the legislature in. But someone's going to have to...
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, is the governor asking you, alluded to this earlier, I mean, I don't want to say who's right or wrong, but it is what he's asking for an impossibility of Mike Madigan and the Democratic leadership, because it would be committing political suicide to give him those.
It would be impossible to gut the labor unions. They might be able to agree to some other restrictions. They can certainly agree on other areas like workman's comp, which labor unions care a lot about, but business cares about maybe more. And it's some of the rules that we have for unemployment insurance and workman's comp do need reform, and everybody can see that they need reform. And so it's probably possible to solve those kinds of problems beyond the budget. Term limits, I think the legislature could give in on. The remap, they would not like to give in on, and they may not be willing to, because that would dictate what would happen in 2020 and the future of politics in Illinois. I think they should. I think the remap is a disgrace in Illinois, but I don't know that they're going to give in on that. So the governor can get half a loaf and come back and work on, for instance, there is a fair map campaign that's trying to end the remap. Maybe he has to get the remap through the fair map campaign rather than through the budget.
And that can be done by getting enough signatures to put it as a constitutional amendment on the ballot and the legislature.
They've got 2/3 of the signatures they need, and the governor, when he was still a private citizen, backed that last time. Hopefully they've rewritten it so it'll stand constitutional challenge this time. There are other ways to get some of the governor's other policies. So the governor, if the governor's saying you have to have 100% of what I want or I won't play at all, that's not solvable. We also have a problem. Let's suppose they decided, okay, we'll make a deal on all these other side issues, and we'll deal with the budget. Well, the budget, no matter whether you talk about the Democrat budget or the Rauner budget, they're $4 to $5 billion out of sync because they have built the budget as if there were still income tax money from the old income tax rates. So they're going to have to raise the income tax, whatever else they do. There's no other $4 or $5 billion solution. And the real issue all along has been who's going to wear the jacket for that, who's going to be, and Madigan has said, yes, we'll vote for the income tax increase if some Republicans will be part of it, so it's a bipartisan agreement. Well, the Republicans in the legislature don't want to do that, but I think the governor's going to have to give way. He said he's willing to do some revenue measures. You know, they really need to get down to the serious business of governing and budgeting because we're all harmed when they don't. And we may not be happy with the exact result, but any result is better than this gridlock. And the fact that that we're governing by court decision to keep certain groups paid, but other groups cannot be paid, and that we're paying as if it were last year's budget when we don't have last year's money. This is not the way to run a railroad.
Right. I was just going to say, a lawmaker the other day pointed out exactly what you just said. We're spending as if last year's level, but we don't have the income that went off last January. We have about $4.5 billion less in revenue. So we're just creating an enormous gap between revenue and income that the state comptroller said could mean we would have as much as $13 billion in unpaid bills by the end of this year.
Yes, and you know that's also a problem if you're trying to run a business or an agency. Suppose you're a doctor and you're providing medical services to state employees or someone like that, and you don't get paid for 6 or 9 months. Well, you can sustain a little of that as a business model, but you can't sustain it if that's the main part of your practice. And so you're going to have, you know, doctors are already beginning to say, well, if you're getting state insurance through Cigna, even though you're a state employee and the state's paying it, we're just not going to take those. We're not going to do big procedures. You can come in for a doctor's visit, but if you're having an operation, you go to the public hospital down the block. We're not going to be stuck with the bill.
Before we move on to something else, last thing, you speaking on term limits, you had given a talk before in favor of term limits, and there's an argument that's often made by those who are opposed to it that if you had term limits, you would lose the institutional knowledge and only the lobbyists and staff would be running the place and not the elected officials. What is your take on that?
Well, I have the practical experience. When I was alderman, it took me a month or two to get up to speed to be able to be alderman and to lead a significant section of the city council against Mayor Daley and the 45,000 employees who worked for the city. I know it takes a while, and you get more familiar if you go through the first budget cycle and so forth. There are things you learn, I don't deny that. But with an 8, and particularly with a 12-year term limit, there's no need. You shouldn't take a learning curve of something like that. You learn in the first year, you're not going to learn. It has been my experience with public officials. Also, public officials usually come in with an agenda, with a program, with a constituency, and they're going to do their most creative work in their first few terms. They're not going to be as creative and offering the new ideas 8 years later. If they're still good public officials, they should run for another office and serve in another capacity. Our founding fathers thought it was best to serve in public office for a while and to go back to being a citizen and then serve in public office again in some other capacity. That was the model on which this republic was set up.
We also want to talk, you have this year, 2015, come out with 2 different books that you're an author or co-author on, and one is Corrupt Illinois, which probably doesn't surprise anybody, but why did you write this book? And let's talk about, why does it seem, and we can go on down a long litany of people who have served in one capacity and another, elected office or appointed office in Illinois. We just had the head of the Illinois schools have to come out and cop a plea. Why is there this culture of corruption in Illinois?
Okay, so first of all, let's start with how bad it is. We are the most corrupt metropolitan region in the country, the Chicago metropolitan region, and the state is the 3rd most corrupt state in the nation. We estimate that the corruption cost, or the corruption tax, is at least $500 million a year. So some of the budget problems we have would disappear if we didn't have the corruption. Besides, it would promote businesses to want to come here and corruption not stand in the way of businesses coming here. So it's a serious problem. There were 1,982 public officials go to jail between 1976 and 2013. It takes a while to get the corruption statistics. We're going to do another report in a month of what it's been like in 2015. But I can tell you there are at least 50 public officials every year who go to jail in the state of Illinois, convicted in federal court with the full evidence. And these are big crimes. Barbara Bennett had a corrupt contract of a little more than $20 million, was going to get a $2 million payout for doing it. Jesse Jackson Jr. just came out of jail. His wife, Sandy Jackson, just went in jail. This former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Dennis Hastert, has pleaded guilty to corruption. We have Aaron Schock down in the southern Illinois in Peoria, who is being fully investigated, and we all expect there to be an indictment. And on the list goes. Like I say, there's at least 50 every year. And some of these are big dollar crimes, and some of them harm in other ways. I mean, we not only have the loss of money, we have the loss of life. Under George Ryan as Secretary of State, people lost their lives because truck drivers got licenses that they bought with bribes, and on and on. As to why this happens, the short answer is when we have machine politics, whether it's Republican machines or Democratic machines, sort of one-party control of parts of the state, you build up a culture of corruption because they live on patronage, they live on favors, they live on corrupt contracts, and it's sort of everybody does it. The system made me do it. It wasn't my fault. This is the way the system is. Well, that's not true, but nonetheless, it does build a culture that makes it likely that people are going to use corruption. Businessmen are going to be willing to pay bribes, and politicians are going to seek bribes because that's the way business is done in all parts of Illinois. And there are individual places that are clean, but it shows up in surprising places. Who knew that Dixon, Illinois had $53 million for the comptroller to steal? Cicero, the mayor or president of Cicero, stole $12 million from insurance, and so the story goes on and on. And it's we compiled it because the book because we wanted to show what were the causes, what were the costs, what were the patterns. There's more than one pattern of corruption, and then finally, what would be the solution. And we present an 8-point program of ending corruption in Illinois, which would take decades.
You mentioned there are 8 possible solutions to some of the corruption. What are some of those?
So the easy ones are things like transparency and accountability measures. The only one that's been accomplished this year in a significant way is we're now going to require civics to be taught in the high schools for the first time. And that will help train an additional generation as long as we teach it with civic engagement. And we teach about corruption and not just the 3 branches of government and what we need to do to end corruption. The other things that can be done are things like term limits and a fair remap, methods to encourage participation, moving the March primary to warmer seasons, making it more easy to get the legislation out of committees where it's been bottled up and onto a full floor debate and vote. Obviously, we have to elect public officials who not only say they're for reform, but actually are for reform. And the last and most important one is destroying machine politics. And that is something that's is a slow process and isn't done in a day.
I have often said privately that it seems to me, and I am not from Chicago, but that there seems not to be any competitive races in Chicago. I mean, if there's a Republican Party, it's virtually invisible in the city of Chicago. How difficult would it be to have a Republican Party that can actually have a competitive race so that we have competition within the political parties in the city?
Well, the Republican Party, back when I was alderman and before, made a fundamental mistake when they used to be the dominant party in Chicago, not the Democrats, until 1931. They continued to operate as a patronage party when they didn't have patronage. They didn't switch over. And they have no A-team. At the moment, there are no members of the city council who are Republican. When there was only one. There are no officials in the county government who are Republican. So you have to build up from the bottom. You would and there are still plenty of people who vote Republican in presidential elections or might vote for Mark Kirk to be reelected as a U.S. Senator who live in Chicago. But you have to be able to give them a series of candidates for local office, and they're certainly the same kinds of Republican principles would be possible to be translated for local office. But the Republican Party hasn't done that.
The one other thing, before we move on to a different topic, I just want to get your thought. It seems to me as well that, again, I grew up in St. Louis. So in Missouri, you have Kansas City balancing St. Louis. You have a myriad of other smaller cities that are about the same size, Cape Girardeau, Springfield, Columbia, Missouri. The problem in Illinois is that you have so much power in such a small geographic area that when you start counting the people that actually matter politically within the state, you can almost name them on one hand.
Well, but the state is still basically 3 geographical areas, what's called downstate, the suburbs and the city. And the suburbs are a balancing block between the city and the rest of the state. Actually, Chicago has 2.7 million people. The metropolitan region, even in the state of Illinois, has 9 million. So even in Cook County, it's almost hit a tipping point because Cook County has 5.5 million people. So it's really the Chicago region, and the Chicago region goes very far because of the exurbs anymore. So I don't see that as the problem. If Chicago and Chicago metropolitan politics were good, we would still have places like East St. Louis and others that had to be corrected as well, but it wouldn't be the problem that it is.
Let's before time gets is always short in the enemy, but you have a second book that actually just came out, 21st Century Chicago. Why did you write this book?
Well, this book tries to bring together 70 authors, 34 chapters, and it talks about the social, political, economic, and governmental conditions of the metropolitan region. So we are thinking of Chicago as a whole region. And we think about the forces of globalization very clearly. What does it mean to be a global city? One of the problems of being a global city is the gap between the rich and the poor gets greater, not smaller. So we're trying to redesign or think about how, as a global city, we might not have this wide income inequality.
What causes that? Why would it being a global city exacerbate that?
Because you get the big top jobs with $1 million or four-figure kinds of salaries, and at the bottom, you no longer need the people. When you had like manufacturing and you had a lot of jobs that were paid well but didn't require a huge education. So you get what's called an hourglass economy. We have shrunk in Chicago, the city, to where only 14% of the census tracts are middle class anymore. It used to be more than 50%. So we've had a vast redesigning of the city. Globalization is only a sort of catchword to describe a lot of different things that are happening. And some of them are quite good. You know, Millennium Park, getting tourists, having more conventions, creates jobs and creates wonderful facilities for all of us to enjoy. My university is a global university in a sense. We have foreign students here, and that helps. But we have to find a way to do that well. And we also have to find a way to transition from 19th century institutions trying to deal with 21st century problems. To give one example, there are 540 governments in Cook County with the power to tax, and there are 1,200 in the region. If someone asked me, I could easily get rid of several hundred of them and be no problem at all. You'd never notice they were gone, and we would be much more efficient and cheaper. But we grew up organically, and that's the way it is, and we have to redesign our government. We have to make our education system better. We have to solve some economic problems, and we have to change the politics. The old machine politics, even upgraded to Mayor Daley and Mayor Emanuel, is not adequate for what we will need to be in the rest of this century.
I often said that it used to be that government went down the highway at 50 miles an hour or 20 miles an hour while the private sector was going down the highway at 50 miles an hour. It seems today the cycle of change is so much more rapid that the private sector is advancing at 120 miles an hour and government's going about 30 miles an hour.
Yes.
The comptroller Leslie Munger is dealing with computers that are 30 years old, and yet any number of departments of government, they deal with billions of dollars of revenue.
Or the
30-year-old computers.
You know, one of the issues in the upcoming election is the clerk of the circuit court. Her clerks are still using carbon paper. Everybody else files stuff electronically.
Why is it, to use those examples, no private sector company would have revenues in the billions of dollars and operate with 30-year-old computers? And speaking of corruption, someone else has told me that makes it so easy to rip off the government because they don't have the ability to check databases from one to the next. Why is it, speaking of 21st century Chicago or 21st century Illinois, that government does that where no rational entity and organization would do that?
Well, partly it has to do with funding. Government tries to stay frugal and doesn't upgrade as often as they should. And secondly, often the people who run government don't have the training, the experience, the background to understand how to modernize rapidly enough. You know, we get used to doing things the same old way, and the same old way just doesn't work anymore.
Is that a threat, speaking of the future of democracy? And, you know, we've all had this experience where you run in and you talk to some younger people, and it's almost like the jaywalking, where sometimes they just don't know things that seemingly used to be fundamental knowledge.
Well, we do have a series of challenges to democracy. You know, one of them is the decline of the news media. The way news is transmitted to the public now is essentially in headlines or TV capsules that are, you know, the studies of even presidential elections. It used to be you had, you know, full statement. Think of the Lincoln-Douglas debate kind of thing. Now, even presidential candidates are normally get 7 or 8 seconds on the news hour that evening. You can't make a good point. I mean, you can make a slogan. You can be a Donald Trump and pound the table and say get rid of immigrants or bomb somewhere, but you can't have a rational discussion in those terms. So we have a lot of different problems. I guess the good news is we are making some progress, and these are solvable. It's partly knowing what it is we want to do and having a vision. We end 21st Century Chicago. First, we're trying to start a conversation about each of these areas. In the area of the social problems, we're not dealing so much with individual problems like crime and education. We're dealing with the fact that race and wealth are connected in ways that are harmful across all of them, and so on across all the areas we cover. And in the end, we're calling for, let's have a common vision of what we want the metropolitan region to be in the 21st century. And then we can worry about electing the people and writing the laws to get us there. It is doable.
Professor Dick Simpson, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Glad to be with you, Terry.